in 1854, Fred Whitney was born in Atlanta, Georgia, in September. As a young buck, he was, according to the stories I can find, very adventurous as a young man. So from that point, I have just a little bit of history when he was in his 20s. So, you know, you're talking, what, 1874, 75 era. His uncle gave him 2,000 acres of land in Texas. So he ventured to Texas to check the land out. When he got there, all he said he could find was rattlesnakes and blackjacks. So in his 20s, he hired on with all the trail crews that were bringing cattle from Texas to here during that time. So that was his job for a few years, was just trailing cattle, go back, regather more, and come. In 1885, late 80s, 1885 in there, he brought 3,000 head of cattle from Texas for Otto Frank to this area. After 1885, he pretty well located here and did, for 3 or 4 years, he did some odd ranch jobs and those kind of things for people. But he has one story that he tells when they brought that group in 1885 of cattle. He can remember there were 60 Crow Indian lodges sitting on the YU ranch where the hayfields are now. So, you know, the area is pretty heavy in Indian anyway. But after that, and he started this place right here in 18, what did I tell you? Now I gotta look it up. Because the 1800s it's pretty sketchy. Give me a second. 88. I knew I was going to get it wrong. So basically, right here where we're sitting, the original house was right in here. The original house became the bunkhouse later on. There was another house right at the cattle guard as you crossed in right here. So all these buildings, that barn is the original from the 1880s. The pictures I have of that barn where we have our corrals now, this side was totally open. That whole side down to almost this tree over here, that was one big sheep pen right there. And there's a picture of it in the museum, and I think there's a little over 1,000 head from what you can see in that picture. So predominantly, he was all sheep in this for here. So that was mainly he's a real adventurer, you know. Sometime during 1890, he wandered up when the ore mine was going. That part of the history's kind of sketchy about how it all fits. How did he ranch plus do the ore mine at Kerwin and then back to here? The guy was a rambler. I will say that with confidence. So after that, now I got to go back to my history lesson. So when he was still in this area, in 1891, the story is he was credited for shooting the last buffalo in this area, between here and Worland. And that was at the fork of Grass Creek in 1891. The original story was the last one was shot or killed by Jack Hollywood like 2 years before down on the Knowood. So one of the stories about him was, you know, that was his claim to fame for the last buffalo in the Bighorn Basin, basically. So, and then as he went on, he still obviously ranched here and there and did his other things. And then I'll try and catch you up to the 20s, and Lili's probably going to have to help me with some of this because my memory's pretty short from way back there. In 1920, somewhere 2021, that I can find. I can't find an exact date, but he had taken out a loan to invest in the silver mines in Nevada. Well, something happened in that time frame, depending on which family sides you talk to. Schlinkers are actually part of the Whitney family because that's Gay's grandfather, right? Fred Whitney was Gay's grandfather. So when Fred went off on one of his adventures for the silver mines in the 1920s, Eugene, the Phelps-Belden family, ended up with the whip. So the story in between is whichever side you want to talk to, how that happened. Doesn't matter. We just know in 1920, it became part of Phelps' Belden family.
And the Pitchfork Ranch.
And, yeah, because at that time, in the Pitchfork. So it still stayed sheep during that time, and behind the rock here was a big, you know how long that barn was? It was a huge lambing shed back here. And I don't know what year Jack
I don't ever remember it.
had it taken down, but there were more buildings here. I had Dan Griffin kind of point out where these buildings were because he was here since he was a little kid. But right here in the middle where this kind of low spot is, this is the chicken house, the original chicken house. And then this building that's no longer here, his relative showed up here about 8-10 years ago on Labor Day and brought me some pictures of this place from the 30s and the 40s. So I'm kind of mixing because my memory's bringing back some of those. But his relatives, when they were little kids, there were a couple of them, that there was a barn right there where they kept the milk cow, right in the middle here between that one and that one. And those kids would get on that rock. And for like 6 months, they carved and carved and carved. Well, they carved a big, huge chunk of sandstone out, and their dad had told them, don't. Well, guess what? They carved it out, and it went through the top of the milk barn. So 2 little kids probably didn't sit down for quite some time. So, as I said, so right here on the hill, there was an old fence in those pictures that he sent me a disc with about 100 and some pictures on it from late 30s to, I think it was 1949. It's very interesting. A lot of this is still here, but that whole hillside was where the milk cow had grazed. And to this day, you can still see it's hard to get grass to grow there. I mean, it's basically has sterilized that part of the ground from that's the only place that milk cows were allowed to go was right there. So in this field out here, and that picture I do remember was 1941. I remember that there was a little kid directly out here about 100 yards from where we're at right now. That entire field was a wheat field. And that kid must have been, well, I don't know, I'd say he's that high. The wheat in this field was that much taller than he was, and they hadn't cut this piece yet. But behind here, you could see all the shucks standing in that field from here to the very far as you can see. And the Griffin guy told me this soil was very, very fertile, and that portion and that kind of wheat would grow here like a weed with very little water. So it's amazing to look back at all these pictures to see what's still the same but what has changed, and not changed in a whole lot. But there's pictures of this house, well, what's left of it. So when they were little kids, the Griffin kids, they were over here playing around this house, and they were digging around in the ground. The foundation for it is still, pieces of it are still there. I told Lili I got digging around there 2 weeks ago, and I found the legs, the cast iron legs off the fancy old stove. So there's still some things in there, but they were playing in there. He still has it. They found a pistol from the army that was here when they were doing trading with the Indians. So I kind of asked him if he'd be willing to part with it, and he told me no. But when they dug it up, he said all they found, they just thought it was a chunk of wood. They found the handle was sticking out, so they kept digging, and they found it. It's about this long. They took it in and had it cleaned up over the years and that kind of thing. So there's still some remnants of all that stuff. It's just you gotta know where to look. So that's, when Fred left here, to go back to him for a minute, the house by Lufkin's, the blue house.
It's purple now.
Okay,
Yeah.
purple. It was blue. That's where Fred moved from here when he moved to town. And at that point, I kind of lose track of him until we find the obituary. He was 96 years old when he died. 76 years of his life he spent right here in Meeteetse. Everybody from the stuff I found in the museum and Dan said nobody called him Fred, everybody called him Whit. So that's how the Whit stayed the Whit. And that's where we are to this point. But there's one kind of funny story about him that I can't remember who the guy was and what year. It's McNally or something. He was in town with his horse, had it tied up, and this other guy shot this other guy. It was a jealousy thing back in the day. Shot him dead right on the street at close range. Well, the bullet went through him, and Fred was putting his bridle on his horse, and it went right through the bottom of his arm. He survived. But the other guy, not so lucky. So that gets us as much as I can find that I can dig up from that part of 1800 to 1920. But when it became part of the Pitchfork and the Beldens and the Phelps, it basically was run the same sheep, that kind of thing. Dan told me this was the lambing area and the shearing area. They would bring those sheep here in the winter, the lamb, and do their thing here, and then they would disperse from there on out. One little story said, can't remember his name now. He was out here raking hay one day when Jack's uncle was here.
No, Hugh Von Crozic.
And Hugh sent him out here to rake the hay so that they could bale it. And Dan says, I can remember as a kid, he made it about halfway across that field and the tractor stopped. 2 hours later, the tractor was still in the same place. So Hugh went down there to see what was wrong, and he was underneath the tractor taking a nap. And Hugh said, what are you doing? He goes, that bolt's loose up there, and I've been tightening it. And Hugh must have told him, not for 2 hours, so get the tractor moving. But he got caught napping. So, you know, there's a lot of those good old character stories, and I kind of like hearing those. They're more entertaining than the others. So, anyway, let me get caught up again.
You forgot to mention when Fred got married.
Oh, yeah. I knew I was skipping all over. That was in 1891, and he married Leona Brown, whose family homesteaded on Dick Creek. So they had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. Fred Jr., Don, and according to what I understand, Don lived in Cody for quite some time. Fred Jr. lived in Cheyenne, and then Dorothy is Gay's mother, correct? And then Dorothy had 4 kids?
3.
3. So that's how the Schlinkers tie to us and all of the Whitneys. So Dorothy would be Fred's daughter, and they had Gay and Jess, and I can't remember the other. There were 2 boys and a girl. My mind's slipping because it's
Joe
racing.
Black.
Huh?
Joe Black.
Joe Black. So that's how Schlinkers and the Whits are connected, and now connected by marriage to Lili. So I kind of jumped around the road. So this was always part of Pittsburgh. In 1945, the Beldens split from
The film.
Phelps, Helen, and she had 2 daughters, Franny and Betty Thomas. So, and this all happens in December. Family splits must happen in December at the end of the year. Start a new year, a new life. So Franny, Betty, and Helen ended up with the Whit, the 91, RTL, and the Perkins place down there. So they later, again, 2000. So when that split happened, there were 2,000 head of sheep that went with this place, plus 30 head of Rambouillet ewes, and then whatever machinery was here. So that part was all the Phelps split up at that time. Then, here we go again in December 31, 1958, the Pitchfork reacquired the Whit back into the Pitchfork Ranch, but in 1981 and 2, or 85, 81 was the armed,
Well, I think you're kind of getting out of order.
Yeah, I am, because my mind is ahead of me. So I'll back up. In 1958, the Whit was reacquired by the Pitchfork again.
From Franny.
From Franny. So Betty still kept the 91, and at that time still the TL, right? Or just the 91?
She kept the 91. Franny had the Whit, and Aunt Helen had the Bar TL and the Meeteetse Creek Cottonwood property, but Jerry Housel ended up buying that from Aunt Helen.
I knew you were going to have to help me. So that had, and then on December 31st, 1999, the Pitchfork sold, and Turnell Cattle Company became the Whit, the Armstrong, and the Herman. So to this day, we're here. Hopefully, we don't do this again on a December 31st day. 'Cause at that time, it might be a cold day in hell, and I'll be dead by then.